I grew up in a rural town in Australia. Anyone who has lived in rural Australian town will tell you that they're all the same. They all have a quaint sort of rustic charm, but they're quite dull places to live. I've spent my whole childhood in this town, riding my bike around with my friends, swimming in the river. All in all, it wasn't a bad place to grow up, but I always felt confined by it. When I was around 14 years old, myself and a friend of mine decided to try to get a show on the local FM radio station. I was inspired by watching Wayne's World and thought that becoming a radio host would be my foot in the door to fame and stardom. But the reality was that we were just bored teens who were looking for a way to kill time. Everyone in town listened to local radio stations, which was mostly broadcast local cricket scores and bagpipe music to appease the people in the old folks' home. My friend and I wanted something a bit more fresh and hip to appeal to the younger audiences, so we were given a late night slot on Thursdays to do more or less whatever we wanted. The show was run by a small team of volunteers that couldn't afford a purpose-built studio, so they rented a space at the old water treatment facility just outside of town. It seemed like an odd place for a radio station, but it was on the top of a hill that overlooked the whole area, so it functioned very well from a broadcasting perspective. It was also completely unused, as the local council had shut down the water treatment plant years ago. The studio itself took up a tiny room just off the foyer, which was soundproof and decked out with the latest radio equipment. It had a few computers, a mixing desk, as well as 3 microphones, one for the host and 2 across the desk for guests and extras. The rest of the plant was empty, save for the huge pipes and empty water tanks. As no one used these rooms anymore, all the electricity was in the foyer and the studio, leaving the entire plant in the dark. When in the studio, talking away on air, it was easy to forget that you were even in such an industrial space. Although when it came time to leave after every show, turning off all the lights and heading into the night always creeped us out. We'd often flip the lights and run as fast as we could down the car park where our parents were waiting to pick us up. Despite the fact that we never ventured farther than the foyer or the studio, there was something unsettling about that huge, empty plant. We'd never explicitly talk about it or mention it, but it obviously scared us both. So my friend and I ran our show. I was the host and she was the co-host. Every week, we'd bring in new music and take requests. Sometimes, people even phoned in to talk on air, particularly one local truck driver named Leroy, who was a big Nirvana fan. We knew that there probably weren't many people listening, but it was just a way for us to kill time on a Thursday night that we'd otherwise have to spend at home. It became part of the routine and admittedly a little boring. After a few months, we found ourselves repeating songs and stories, letting playlists run instead of interjecting between every song with a stinger or a joke. Sometimes we'd get so bored that we'd both leave the studio and head back into the foyer while we were on air, daring each other to venture out into the dark space amongst the pipes and tanks. I was a cocky 14-year-old kid, and I'd like to strut in there as if I wasn't afraid while my friend cowered behind the doorframe. I'd only ever make it 4 or 5 steps past the door before I dashed back to join her. Something about that darkness. It felt threatening. It felt like if I ventured too far in, I'd never get out. I was always so glad to return to the brightly lit studio where the familiarity served as a buffer between us and the darkness. The studio was our safe place. One night, in the middle of winter, there was a storm. It the typical heavy rain, thunder, and lightning affair. Being tucked away in our soundproof and air-conditioned studio, we could barely notice. Even so often, the room would light up as lightning flashed, and we'd hear a low rumble of thunder. But that was it. We carried on with the show as usual. During a song break, I was browsing the web on the computer behind the desk, checking out Facebook, and seeing if there might be something interesting to talk about after the song. I found some funny memes and told my friend to come around the desk and check it out. She stood behind my chair laughing as we scrolled through some more funny images until I felt her grab at my shoulder. She let out a scream, which scared the hell out of me. I looked up to see her mouth agape, pointing across the desk. As I turned around, my stomach dropped. Across the desk, the 2 guest microphones that were always attached to the stands pointing down were standing completely vertically. The stands were so old and delicate that they creaked any time you even tapped the microphone, and I'd never seen them extended so far. We both only looked away for 30 seconds at the most, and there was simply no way they could have shot up without us seeing or hearing them move. But there they were, straight up from the desk, almost brushing the ceiling. As we stared, the lights in the room seemed to dim and the atmosphere became heavy. We were both absolutely terrified. Our eyes darting from the microphone stands to each other. We were almost in tears. We just couldn't explain it. For the rest of the show, we did nothing but play songs. No talking on air, and no stingers in between tracks. We didn't even speak to each other. We pulled the stands down and let the rest of the show play out, counting down the seconds until we could leave. Finally, the show was over, and we both had the same realization. We had to turn off the lights and lock up. We sat in the studio and talked it out. But when she started crying and telling me how afraid she was, I told her that she could leave first and I'd lock up myself. I didn't need to give her another chance. She bolted out of the room and through the rain to the car park. Alone, I grabbed my bag of CDs and made my way to the foyer. All the while, an intense feeling of dread seemed to build up in me. Each step I took drove the feeling deeper inside of me until I reached the switches on by the front door. With a finger trembling on the main light switch, I prepared myself. I decided I'd close my eyes, find the front door by feel. I was familiar with the place. It should be easy. I felt that if I opened my eyes in the darkness, I'd be swallowed by it. I couldn't explain what happened that night, and I couldn't explain my fear, but I knew I couldn't look into the darkness. The fear was so intense, I couldn't believe I was still standing on my jelly legs. I took a deep breath, shut my eyes, and flicked the switch. With my eyes closed, I started to focus on the sounds around me. I could hear the low hum of the computers in the studio, the rain beating down on the concrete outside. I tried to focus on these sounds as I fumbled my hands along the wall, trying to find the door. Stepping slowly in the direction I knew the door was in, and brushing my hands along the wall, I focused intently on the sounds, the rain, the computers, the blood rushing through my ears, the scraping. The sound cut through my mind, the unmistakable sound of metal on metal. The deep rumble of something sliding along the pipes in the darkness behind me. Nothing I had ever heard before. As I heard the sound, I faltered. My legs gave way and I fell to my knees. My hands left the wall and hit the ground to stop me from falling completely. The scraping came again, directly behind me. I scrambled on the floor, trying to find my feet, trying to find the door. All while my eyes were shut tight. The more I scrambled, the further I seemed to get from the wall. I reached out my hands. They touched nothing. I crawled forward, couldn't find anything except the cold concrete floor. I felt the darkness, the fear creeping in towards me. I had to get out of there. I had to get out. If I could take a moment to quickly open my eyes and adjust to the darkness, maybe I could find the door. Despite all my thrashing and fumbling, my eyes closed. I just couldn't find my way. I stopped scrambling, sat up, and opened my eyes to the darkness. Directly in front of me, I saw it. The door. I saw my shadow cast up against it immediately, felt a flood of relief. I jumped across the room, grabbed at the handle, yanking the door open to the rain and thunder outside. Just as I reached the doorstep and my escape, my stomach dropped again for what seemed like the millionth time that night. I stopped in dread in the doorway. When I'd opened my eyes, I saw the door immediately, as well as my shadow against it. My eyes had been shut so tightly there was no way I could have adjusted to the darkness that quickly. As I stood in the open doorway, I looked down and saw light spilling out from behind me. My legs silhouetted against the wet ground outside. The scraping sound came again, seemingly right behind my head. It was so loud. I literally jumped forward out of the doorway, and I lurched forward. I noticed that the shadow on the ground outside didn't move. I bolted. I ran for the car park without even shutting the door behind me. I jumped in the car with my dad and told him to go as fast as he could. As we peeled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror to see the front door swing shut and the lights turn off.